Hello, and thank you very much. And I'm really, really pleased that this is a majority white audience because my talk is for white people. It's to help, I think, and empower white people to stand up against white supremacy and hopefully start rejecting the title white. My name is Akua Ofosuhene, like he said. I was born in the UK, but I'm a Santi. My people were defeated by the English or the British in 1901 after 7 different wars that lasted a period of about 250, 300 years. And then we were put in with the Gold Coast, which in 1956 became Ghana when we were told that we were independent. But all you have to do is to look at who owns the resources or benefits from the resources of Ghana, and you realise that it's not the indigenous people at all. So nothing really changed from Gold Coast to Ghana. So that's who I am, and I'm a tailor and dressmaker and psychedelic, fashion designer. But that was always kind of like my life, and that's how things were going to stay with me until I decided to move from the UK when I realised I was pregnant with a son, and I knew I didn't want him to grow up here. So it took a while, and when he was 8, we were able to go to Ghana. For 5 years, we had a brilliant life because we were returnees, so we were automatically middle-class people. He went to private school. It was lovely. And then my mother got ill, and we had to come back, and that was about 5 years ago. He was 13. I was a bit worried, but I actually thought he's had a solid African grounding. He's travelled overland with me across West Africa. He knows his history, blah, 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 all of that kind of stuff. And when we got here, in the beginning, it was great. He did well at school. They moved him up a year in English. They said he was borderline genius. He won the school speech prize in the first 10 days of getting here. And, you know, I was really kind of like, yes, I'm a good mum. And then a term later, he was failing in everything. What we learned, or what I've learned actually very, very recently, was that he was really severely bullied in that time when we first came. And he aligned himself with his bullies. And since that time, we've been on a journey of, what do they call it, county lines, knives and drug dealing. And it's been absolutely shocking. As a mum who really was very proud of my African roots and really felt I was doing everything, I was devastated when I realised that my son had been arrested with a knife, that my son had been involved with dealing drugs in school. And I couldn't even, there was nowhere for me to go with it, and I was stuck. I was physically stuck, I was emotionally stuck. I just didn't know what to do. And all I could experience was just this depression and pain, and most of the pain was just all around my chest and my breasts. And it was really interesting because as time's gone on and I've met other parents, I've met now 3 women who've all experienced this and then gone on to get breast cancer, and fathers who have ended up, and mothers who have ended up on antidepressants. I started seeing a counsellor because I realised that I had to develop a backbone to deal with this. And I think after the 3rd session, I just realised that what she was helping me do was too slow. I needed something faster to be able to deal with this. Then I read about frog medicine, Cambo. So I did Cambo, and that was absolutely extraordinary. I could literally feel my organs letting go of all this trauma and being able to start to engage with my son and start to get the strength to actually become police, social worker, and all of those things. But it still wasn't enough, that there was still too much stuff going on. So through Cambo, then I heard about Iboga, and the more I read about Iboga, the more I knew this was the medicine for me. I microdosed Iboga for about 4 months before having the flood dose. And that really was a big turning point for me, because it was like, the medicine just put a rod up my back. So everything that was happening with my son, it was like I was ready to face it, but it was really hard because I realized I was talking to somebody who was not the person I thought he was anymore. He was totally gone. In Ghana, in my language, in Tree, we say the person's head isn't home. And that's how it was. He just was not the Seren. I couldn't have the conversations with him we used to have when he was 8 to 9 years old. And that was really heartbreaking. But I had a really interesting ally, a friend of both you and I, Anya, who really helped me with my journey with the different medicines. So as I would talk to her about what I was facing, what I felt I needed to develop, she was the one who was kind of like, well, maybe you should try microdosing mushrooms. So I did. And I still haven't actually had a big trip on mushrooms yet. I've still only ever used it to get in touch with my feelings. And also I found that it helped me to be able to get in touch with my son's feelings and find ways of speaking to him. And then there came a time when I had to start playing detective. I had to start being able to get the police in different places to speak to each other. Because in this county lines thing, what happens is children are taken from their homes in inner cities and taken across county lines to go and stay in the houses of drug addicts to sell drugs to people. And when this was happening, what was I learned was that sometimes my son would be picked up by the police, and even though I'd fought to get this special thing put on his file saying he was a vulnerable child, all of this stuff, it didn't matter. They would pick him up and they'd drop him off outside the house of the person who was handling him. They had both our addresses, but they would drop him off there. And they wouldn't tell me, they'd tell the social worker, and she would tell me. So I was constantly having to ring up this police force, ring up that police force, tell them, if you look on this file, you will find this piece of information. And all the while trying to get through to my son and trying to get through to the police in his old school, and complete nightmare. But all the time what I realized was the medicines were really what was giving me the strength to be able to fight this thing. And I started meeting other parents, and they were sick, they were depressed, and it was really hard because I'm telling them, well, you know, if you try tapping, that really works. Yes, tapping really works, but what they really needed was big medicine, and big medicine's not allowed for ordinary people. And I've met some parents who their minds were ready, and I've been very honest with them, and they've managed to get their own supplies, and they've managed to become strong to fight this thing. But one of the things that happened with me when I took the Boga flood dose was the kind of experience most people talk about, the oneness, the interconnectedness. But I also experienced this thing that was like an umbrella. And the umbrella was this system that we were all under. And it was like we're all holding on to the umbrella in different ways, but the umbrella was white supremacy. And I realized that even the term white supremacy is really kind of interesting, because what is it? It describes a kind of racialized, oppressive capitalist system that completely subjugates everybody but puts people on slightly different pedestals. So depending where you are, you can kind of imagine that you're doing a bit better than somebody else, but we're all under this umbrella. And I realized that what this umbrella kind of does is it gives different subjugated people different bits of language to describe their experience. And then you're allowed to kind of use that to protest. So women, we've got lots and lots of language to talk about gender issues and everything. Black people, we've got lots of words to describe what's going on with us. But I noticed that there was, under this white supremacist system, there was this really weird thing that happens, that when you say white supremacy racism, with a lot of white people, there's something happens on the inside. There's actually a trauma response. It's either an arguing against it, it's either completely shutting down, going quiet, freezing, or it's ignore it, change the subject. And I realized that, it looks a bit like white people are actually also traumatized, but they're not given the words to talk about their trauma under white supremacy. And it's hidden behind this other term called white privilege. And so white people are supposed to kind of stay in their place and be really happy about this system because apparently it privileged them. But I started looking at certain things around my friends to really see, are people really privileged? Most of my white girlfriends do not want children. And when I ask them about why don't you want children, nearly all of them say, I don't want to bring a child into this world, not under this system the way that it is. And I started to find that really quite fascinating, because if the people who apparently are privileged in this system don't want to bring new life and carry on their genes in this system, it shows they actually, at the most fundamental level, are not feeling this privilege. I wanted to have children. I knew the world that we lived in, and I still wanted to have children. And all of my family want to have children, and we know this world. So I started to realize that there's some unpacking that needs to be done here. And then I think somebody sent me, I'd started having conversations with people, and someone sent me an article about suicide in middle-class white men. And that I found absolutely fascinating, because we're all told that's the pinnacle of the system. If you are a middle-class white man, there's nobody higher than you. So why are they killing themselves in much larger numbers than subjugated communities? And I started to kind of think, where's the place that white middle-class men, or what are the words that they can use to express their dissatisfaction with the system? And I couldn't really find places. I found some interesting books all about racism and understanding biases and political correctness. And what I realized was there was a lot of stuff there for white people who want to tinker around the edges, you know, and you can go and hold up a banner somewhere and talk about deforestation, child labor, poisoning of the earth. You know, there's all these places that it seems like that's where people classed as white are allowed to protest against the system, but they're not allowed to actually touch the big umbrella, which is white supremacy, racism. But racism, I even think, is almost like just another bit of the tinkering. It's really about the wholesale stealing of the world's resources, and then giving everybody a story that says this group of people are the beneficiaries. So let's leave it there. And then everybody else, let's all just be fighting for more rights and all this stuff, while this big oppressive umbrella steals from everybody. And when I started kind of looking at these things and just being shown all this stuff by the medicines, I just kind of realized that, but when you take the medicines, you get to start having this feeling of oneness and the interconnectedness, and you start to realize that there's another reality, or there's the real reality, and all this other stuff has been put on top. And actually, I think what we all need to do, and what white people need to do, is to actually actively take medicines to break the system. Take medicines to reject the title called whiteness. You know, white people were not classified by law until something like 1641. Before then, there wasn't actually a concept that somebody was white. And when they were classed as white, Irish people weren't included, Italians weren't included, Gypsies weren't included. You know, so it's made up. And I think I've been working with a playwright, a white woman who's really up for doing the work, and she's documenting how she's trying to get rid of her own sense of whiteness to be able to fight the machine, because she realizes that you can't fight the machine if you accept the label it's given you. And the first place that she's got to start is to reject it. And when we talk about it, we start to realize these things have never even been kind of like talked about. Where do you find the book for white people about rejecting whiteness? Where are those books? Who's writing those books? I'm hoping that her play will really spark a lot of things to really help white people to reject that title of whiteness and to start to really, really fight the system. Because the system's huge, and it's in everything. There's a man called Neely Fuller Jr., and he writes about how white supremacy is in all areas of life, and there's not a corner on the planet it doesn't exist. It is a massive system, and for us as non-whites, we feel this in so many corners. When I'm dealing with the police with my son, it's always so interesting. There's the two police who come to my house who are really good. They're really, really good, and they're constantly fighting for us. But they have to get on the phone and get information from the last force who've picked up my son, who are not doing what they're supposed to do. And that's white supremacy in action. It's not an accident that my son's school has bred, and I'll call it breeding, a year group that sent 25 boys straight into the system of county lines. I spoke to a senior policeman, and I was saying to him, I don't know why this system can't be broken, because you know where all these boys live. All you've got to do is follow 10 boys across London, and you can arrest enough people to stop children being placed in the houses of drug addicts to sell drugs. And they're telling me this can't be done. And I'm thinking, well, if I had £30,000, I could do it. And you're saying the whole police force can't do it? It doesn't make sense. I found out that one of the key people who created the school my son went to, it was a brand new academy school, is an expert in children's, teenagers' brains. And when I used to go to the school, there was always something weird with how they communicated with us, and I could never put my finger on it. What I've since learned is that that school, the structure in there, was exactly the same as the structure that they have in youth offenders. And isn't it interesting that there was this huge expansion of private youth offending places just before we started to have the county lines thing? Young people are finding boxes of knives in alleyways. I mean, this is how the system works. And I do think it's really incumbent on white people who really want to save the planet to engage in the white supremacist umbrella that's on top of all of us. Because non-whites, we're starting to do the work. Whichever way we're doing it, we're starting to do the work because you have to, because you live in the system and you're feeling it every day. But I think it's now the time for white people to do more than just listen sympathetically. It's to actually do the work internally, to reject this title of whiteness. And in that, hopefully the roads will open to how we get rid of this system. Thank you.